today.
Alrighty. Hey, everybody. As all of you know, I'm Steven. I'm presenting this information on behalf of Karen today. As Kathy mentioned, Karen unfortunately has had some health-related issues with her mom. So if you all can just keep her in your thoughts and prayers with that. But know that she prepared today's didactic presentation, so I'm presenting on her behalf today. So I'll talk to you today about the school readiness process, and I'm going to walk through the different components and share with you where you can find all of your school readiness resource documents that you can start working on as early as today. They're all in the folders for you that I'll share today. So overall, I'll talk about what school readiness entails. I'll also talk about the elements and the timelines behind school readiness, and I'll talk about the purpose and process for collecting some baseline data that you'll be using and accessing with your school teams throughout the next school year in its entirety. So let's dive into this readiness process a little bit. Our readiness process is designed to ensure that your schools understand exactly what's happening in terms of the partnership, what the expectation is for their involvement, both in attending professional learning and echo sessions we have next year, and clearly outlining the service and support that they'll get from the Behavior Alliance, from you as their district behavior coordinator, and then what they'll do for their school and their staff throughout the course of the year. Our readiness checklist entails the following 4 parts that you can see on the slide, and all of these parts have associated resources that I'll go over later in the presentation. The first part of readiness is a readiness overview session. So we have a slide deck for that readiness overview session that you'll use. You'll be able to co-design that time together with your Behavior Alliance point of contact. And ideally, that school readiness overview session is taking place towards the beginning of next school year, between now and the beginning of next school year. And that's totally going to depend on your audience within your district. So if you know you want to get in front of your building principals early because they need to know that information and they're kind of nosy Nellies or they like to be informed early on, it's great to get in front of them as early as possible. So we'll give you that deck and you can start to think about, oh, I'd like to talk to my building principals first. I'm going to talk to them in the month of May before they leave for the summer or after the school year ends because they're fresh and still there. But at the end of the day, you can think, that school readiness overview, I want to start with principals. Here's where I want to deliver it to them. And then maybe I want to deliver a second session to their school leadership team. That all is up to you and your Behavior Alliance point of contact. But the point would be, we want to let people know in an official overview format that is about 30 minutes in length what they're getting into in terms of the partnership with the Behavior Alliance and the MTSS for behavior work. Also, part of readiness is telling us who's on their school team. School teams are about 5 to 8 people. Ideally, and most logically, they're around 5 just for logistics and getting those folks released to the professional learning next school year. But that's obviously contextually relevant to the size of the school itself. In addition to that school team roster, we have a principal agreement form that principals actually sign, very similar to what you all did by identifying your district leadership team that meets and getting your superintendent signature on the partnership packet. We follow that same model down to the school level with the roster and the agreement form. And then also at the start of next school year, the school will administer the self-assessment survey that gives us some feedback on behavior systems, resources, and tools that help people learn and associate with effective tier 1 practices. And I'll talk a little bit about some tools to monitor completion on that later in the presentation. On the next slide, I'll overview a little bit more about that readiness information. So talking more specifically about the school team roster, I'm sure this looks familiar to most of you because it looks pretty similar to what you did for the district leadership team roster. It's just different in terms of the school level now. That school team roster is ideally completed by the administrator at the school saying, here's who I'm going to dedicate to meeting monthly at my school. Here's who I want to empower to lead tier 1 MTSS for behavior work at the school. And in totality, we're looking for that school team to be between 5 and 8 people. Our first cohort of schools, most of them had 5 people. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, that was largely because they needed to release them for 3 days of professional learning. But we are pretty staunchly in support of it being at least 5 people. So you've got to really keep in mind that communication about the expectation of at least 5 people. We really want this to be a team-based approach, just like all of you are doing at the district level, at the school level. So it's really important for that school leadership team to be multiple people with varied roles. So we always say that the administrator is automatically a member of the team, and it has to be that there is administrative authority on that team. So we say it has to be at least one administrator. We always recommend that that school team also include educators, teachers. So we generally recommend at least one special education teacher and at least one regular education teacher. The asterisk there will always be dependent upon the size of your schools and the makeup in terms of like, are you a elementary school, middle school, high school, that sort of stuff. It's also helpful to have somebody who has some level of behavior expertise, but also those support staff roles, the counselors, school psychs, those types of roles generally have a little bit more release time on their calendar, so they don't have to have coverage when they're out of the building. So those are generally helpful people to also have on the team. And then the school team coordinator is going to serve in a very similar role to all of you at the district behavior coordinator level, at the school level. They're going to be the point of contact for all things with the partnership. They're going to facilitate the meetings. They're going to work really closely with you as a district behavior coordinator. So thinking through these roles early with your school teams is really important to make sure the right people are in the right place doing the right types of work. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that checklist and those team roles. We do have that requirement that I mentioned earlier of the administrator. And like your district leadership team roles, we want the school team to assign out specific roles. So we have a minimum of 5 that are required: administrator and school team coordinator, the note taker, timekeeper, and school community liaison. And on this side specifically, I just want to highlight number 1 and number 2. The administrator is separate from the school team coordinator. That is purposeful. We really want the person who's owning the leadership of this work not to be the principal, ideally because that provides some shared leadership at the school level. So we really want the principal on the team and as part of the team, but we want the collective team and people on the team feeling more ownership in running and really taking the ownership of doing the work. And while the district behavior coordinator, all of you and your implementation support partner, is not actually going to be listed as part of the team, they're going and you're going to want to be sure that you know when the meetings are taking place and you are able to attend those meetings where possible to make sure the work continues to move along. So we just wanted to make that note. And then we do have those 2 additional suggested roles just to give you some more information. In the actual readiness packet, we have the screenshot on this page of more details if you want some more details about what those roles entail. But that's in the packet for you to look at later on your own time. On the next slide, we talk a little bit more about that principal agreement. The principal agreement highlights are that they're highlighting and they're really going to dedicate protected meeting time. So at least 1 hour a week for the school team to meet. There's also going to need to be dedicated time for that school team coordinator to work with you as the district team to make sure you're meeting with them. We'll support you all in kind of designing what those meetings look like, ideally on a quarterly basis with those school team coordinators. And then they are committing to going back and doing things as a result of attending the professional learning. That includes getting feedback from various groups within the school, staff, students, community members, that they'll give some staff meeting time to go back and have the school team present what they've learned about during the professional learning and implement. And then obviously a commitment to data. All of you are familiar with us enough to know that we really focus on data. So we want to highlight that in the commitment agreement. And you see on this commitment agreement, there's a spot for the signature from the school principal. And then you, as the district behavior coordinator, are going to collect these readiness packets, review them, and also assign your signature to the packet to say that you're agreeing as well. On the next slide, we go into a little bit more detail about the self-assessment process. So I've talked about that overview, I've talked about that roster, and now I'm talking about the actual survey that will be administered to all of the staff members. So what is this self-assessment survey? It's an initial baseline survey that's going to give us perception, staff perception on the effectiveness of behavior systems, but also the priority for improving those behavior systems within the school setting. The idea is that all staff have the ability to give feedback on tier one. Tier one literally means all, it means universal. So we want to make sure that all staff have an opportunity to go ahead and give their feedback. In our model, we try to set the goal for 100% participation in that survey for validity. If we're going to use that data to make decisions, we want to make sure it's reflective of the perspectives of all staff. I'll talk about the asterisk of that a little bit later, but the goal is to have every single staff member, not just teachers, paraprofessionals, folks who monitor the cafeteria, folks who work in the office, anybody who drives a bus for the school. Literally anybody who works or interacts with students should have the ability to provide feedback on the tier one behavior support systems within the school. So when we say all staff, we literally mean all staff. This tool is going to be administered annually from now on in your partnership work with us. So you'll do the baseline at the beginning of next school year. I'll talk about the window a little bit later, but that self-assessment survey is going to be administered as a baseline at the beginning of the school year. And then every year after, the schools will administer that self-assessment survey so that they can track progress over time. And as it says under the why, help the school team identify where they're doing things really well and where they need to improve an action plan to continue to make their tier one system stronger. And then lastly, resources for orienting staff to the survey, i.e. we have some of those, I'll share a little bit about what those look like later, are provided by the Behavior Alliance in late July, so that once the window opens, when the school year starts, the school teams have everything they need to administer that survey. We take care of the administration, the data analysis, meaning we give you all the survey link to access, and then we take care of the analysis and the reporting. So you don't have to do any of that work. The district behavior coordinator role is just to make sure that the schools are informed of the self-assessment survey and its purpose and reach the target participation rate before professional learning. On the next slide, we talk a little bit more about that self-assessment survey to give you an overview of the different parts of the self-assessment survey. The self-assessment survey itself actually measures all three tiers across the work. But for the purposes of the Behavior Alliance work, since you're starting with tier one, that's where we start with the self-assessment survey. So they will give feedback on tier one school-wide practices and systems, and they'll do the same for classroom level practices and systems. So again, that school-wide approach is everybody with all students, and the classroom approach is what staff who supervise and teach groups of students are going to give feedback on in terms of their behavior systems within their classrooms. We administer the self-assessment survey, which the next slide will talk a little bit more about in terms of the four sections and why we do this. On that next slide, Kathy. There we go. We administer that self-assessment survey in an internal platform that we have, and every single item that the staff give feedback on tells us about the current status from the perception and the standpoint of the actual staff member. So is that item in place, not in place, or partially in place? And then it also gives feedback to the team on the priority for improving those things. So the overall idea here is something can be in place in a school, but it really needs to be improved because it's not working. So someone might say, this item is in place, but it's a high urgency to improve it because it's not being effective in my school setting. So the tool is a validated tool that uses that approach to help people think through, well, just because it's in place doesn't mean that it's of high quality and everyone is doing it well, right? So that's why it's designed that way for us to have those two scores on each of the items in the self-assessment survey. Next slide will take us into a little bit more information about rolling out that self-assessment survey. So as I mentioned earlier, we will give you everything you need. This is a screenshot of a PDF from one of our district partners from cohort one. You will have this PDF done by the Behavior Alliance and given to you for you to use with your school teams and in your school settings. Our general mantra behind everything that we do, especially in data collection land, is we need to give people the information ahead of time before they complete something so that they know exactly what they're getting into and why. We want people to know that the survey is anonymous. We want them to know that it's de-identified, that it goes back to the Behavior Alliance for analysis, and that the school team is going to be using this survey to go back and make decisions during professional learning about what needs to be improved and what doesn't. So at the end of the day, the big mantra behind something like this is we want the school team with you all and with us thinking through, how do we get information to the people completing the survey before we just give them the link to do the survey to make sure that we get authentic and meaningful feedback. What we at the Behavior Alliance give you for those resources is we give you a slide deck that you can use and the school team can use to give to the whole staff. If you're doing this, for example, at the start of the school year in a staff meeting, you can use that live deck. We also give you a video recording, a YouTube recording that you can play or give people to play on their own. And we also have a self-paced Canvas module that people can walk through prior to accessing the QR code or the link for the actual survey. So big mantra would be, we're not just emailing this link out to people and saying, fill out the survey. We're going to give them and fill their bucket first and say, learn more about the survey and why it's important, and then fill it out. And then lastly, there is some feedback that we'll give you and some things we've learned from the first cohort, especially about completion rates and really just trying to stay in tune to those completion rates. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of those completion rates and some tips and tricks that we've learned across the process. One of our current district partners, Clarendon, actually decided that internally they wanted to build a Google form. So this is a screenshot from their Google form to say to their staff, hey, we want you to do this survey, fill out this Google form with your email address and the survey link. And they're only collecting that information to see who has done it and how many people have done it. It's not connected to the any identifiable information that we analyze. So they decided to put this in place before the survey link to say, we just want to make sure everybody completes the survey, because guess what? If the school doesn't meet 80% response rate on this survey, they won't be able to continue in the partnership. That's the big deal here. We're really keen on making sure that everybody has an opportunity to provide feedback. And if you're going to really live that mantra of universal and tier one, the feet to the fire that we hold is that at least 80% response rate has to be met in order to proceed in professional learning. So Clarendon put this up there, and look at what they did at the end. They also did a nice little recognition of staff for when they completed the survey to say, what would you like as an opportunity to earn for completing the survey? So they put that there at the bottom. So they did a little intro statement. They did that link. They asked for an email and said that it wasn't associated with their responses, and they gave them that thank you opportunity of recognition. So that was just an example from one of our district partners. I will note that on the Behavior Alliance side, we will, on a weekly basis, once the window opens, share with you how many surveys have been completed at your district so that you'll know by school how many surveys have been completed and who you might need to go give some extra love or support to make sure they reach that goal. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that by saying, here's another idea. During a training or instruction, you might give them the opportunity to do the survey itself and then ask them to take a screenshot of that completed survey and either send that in to an administrator, put that in a Google folder and identify by name, submit that on a Google form as an attachment to say that you've gone ahead and completed the survey. But starting really early on in this process, one thing that we would say is, as all of you know, implementation fidelity is often the missing piece to our work. So what we're really trying to do early on in this process is try to get you to think through how you can monitor implementation fidelity of people completing this survey. So whether it's through a Google form, capturing a screenshot, there's got to be a way, because remember, once that survey is completed, all we are able to tell you is how many surveys are completed. We can't tell you who has or has not completed the surveys because it is de-identified information and we don't collect that information. So just keep that in mind early on. We've got to have a process in place for making sure if someone's absent that day, or if you're doing it in PLCs, how are we going to make sure that people are completing the survey and we get to that goal of as much as possible towards 100% survey completion. On the next slide, let's talk a little bit about timeline. So important timeline information for you to know. First of all, the self-assessment survey window will open on your first day of school for your district. So you can start data collection as early as the end of July once you come back into the school year and your school year starts. We will not open the survey any earlier than that. We want to make sure that the staff who is at the school next year are the ones giving us the feedback on what we're building next year. So the survey won't open until next school year. You as a district behavior coordinator and implementation support partner get to identify when your school readiness packets are due to you. You're the one who's going to collect them from your schools because we want you reviewing them and making sure that they have everything that they need in them. And the packet also includes when the school is going to meet monthly. So we want you to have that information ahead of time so you can put that on your calendar. At the end of the day, we need the readiness packets by September 5th. And that's when the school self-assessment survey window also will close. To get the readiness packets to us, they just have to be uploaded into your district's Google folder. And I'll show you a little bit about where that is today. And the reason why that September 5th deadline is what it is because we need time to be able to make the reports and to do the data analysis because your school teams will get some of that data back on September 18th on the first day of professional learning to make some decisions about what they're going to prioritize in terms of development. And then I think the last part of my presentation is to talk a little bit about, okay, that readiness checklist, great, all that information is there. But the next slide is going to give us a little bit more in terms of what are the resources you have available to you to start thinking through the readiness process now. In your drive, in your Google Drive, I'll show you where to find it. You already have a copy of the readiness packet. I just put it there today, along with the school readiness overview presentation, which you can personalize for your district as you'd like to do. And as with most of our stuff, there's a bunch of yellow on the slides where you can and are encouraged to personalize it for your district. And then we also made a school phase 2 checklist. So at the school level, you can communicate what the whole year is going to look like in their planning year. That's phase 2 for the schools to look through and see what does the whole year look like for a school. It's really a helpful school level document. And then lastly, that beautiful PDF from Lawrence that you saw earlier with all the directions and the survey links, those will also come in your folders and they'll show up in July. We'll prompt you via email about those being available. The next slide shows you where I put those in your folders so you can see. So I used my Anderson's folder to show you in your district folder in the Basque Drive. You now have a school readiness folder in there, and you have all your district specific 3 documents with the checklist, the actual presentation, and then the packets. The only notes would be just remember that each school needs their own packet. So you only have one packet in there right now because I don't know how many schools you selected. So you're going to have to make copies of that document for as many schools as you have and need because each school needs to complete their own readiness packet. I think that's all that I had for my presentation, if I remember correctly. Let's see on the next slide. Yep, that's it. That's all I had for my presentation today. I'd like to thank Karen for putting together these slides for us. And if you have any questions, you know how to reach us. But I think we'll take a moment and see if anybody has any questions for me before we transition. Let's see. Team member roles. If we have a school leader that's adamant about it being the school administrator and the school team coordinator or AP, is there a recommendation to guide? Is it okay? Yep, I see. Yep. So let me just address that for you, Mr. Chandler. At the end of the day, the building principal is the leader at the school. So we're never going to be like, no, absolutely not. You can't do that, right? But I think the arguments to be made is just the logical arguments of building principals already have a ton on their plates. The school team coordinator is going to have a lot of work to do. They're going to be making all the monthly meeting agendas. They're going to be doing all the correspondence back and forth between you and the Basque folks as well. They handle all the logistics of the presentations that need to be done, the staff meeting overviews that need to be had. So I think my biggest piece of advice would be to try to overwhelm a building principal who wants to serve in that role and try to convince them that shared leadership and ownership would be better. We did have last year a few APs who served in the school team coordinator role. All of our schools did not have any principals that served in that role, but we did have a few assistant principals. I think that's okay. I wouldn't push back too hard on that as much just because it's not the principal. I think the goal would be to make it not the principal. The other logical argument is that on the list of roles, one of them is administrator and one of them is school team coordinator. So we need 2 separate roles because they serve 2 different functions. And on the actual list of the roles with the descriptors, you can read more about the language that we would use to delineate the difference between those 2 roles. So hopefully that was helpful, Mr. Chandler. I think I see, let's see. 4 sections of the survey. Would the classroom questions be admitted for? Okay, that's a great question, Mr. Chandler. Thanks for that attention to detail. So we do not actually omit the classroom questions from people who are not in the classroom because they still have connections to classrooms and engage with students across the board. We would just analyze that data a little bit differently. So we don't omit the questions because we want feedback from all on all, because there are still necessary perspectives from people in buildings in terms of what happens within classrooms and schools. We just look at the data differently, if that makes some sense. And then I think I see Deanna with her hand up, so I'll give her an opportunity to unmute and ask your question.
Hey, first, thank you guys for being so thorough with all of the documents and support. It makes it a little bit easier for us to help lead in our district. My question is, with this being something that is a time requirement for schools, is there anything neat or unique that schools that have gone through the process have done to incentivize this for team members?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I'd say probably the most creative thing that I've seen is getting buy-in from both the district level and the building principal level to give either like some extra prep time or some release time in order to actually be able to do meet and build this work across the school year. So one of the biggest barriers to implementing any work within a school, as you know, is time. So I'd say creative thinking around either some bonus prep time, maybe during professional learning days, some dedicated time for planning as a team. Time is probably the biggest dangled carrot that people I've seen give. But also the opportunity just to have these bullet points added onto your resume is always a big thing. Like, you're part of this leadership team, you've gone through this official training process. So just building and filling people's professional cups has been a really successful strategy. Beyond that, I think it's really just specific on the school culture in terms of what they're able to provide beyond that. But one of the biggest things time related to is making sure that there's some sub coverage within the professional learning days. That was a big plus for people. You're going to be released to go to 3 days of professional learning, and we'll cover for you. But I think those probably are the 3 most common I would see or say. Was there a second part to your question, or was that it? I'm sorry, I spaced on whether or not you had a second part.
That's it. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
perfect, no problem. um, okay, any other questions for me before we move it along to the community of practice time today? All right. Well, I just want to thank again